Today is the last Sunday before we enter the season of Lent, next Wednesday, Ash Wednesday. And as every year, we hear this old familiar story of Jesus taking a few of his friends up a high mountain. The church calendar calls this the Feast of Transfiguration. In case you ever wondered what that means, the Oxford Dictionary defines transfiguration as a complete change of form or appearance into a more beautiful or spiritual state. That sounds very cerebral to me. But let me tell you, whatever Peter and his friends expected or anticipated would happen on that mountaintop, it wasn't cerebral at all. I don't think they were prepared for their encounter with prophets and with God and what was coming their way. The Bible says they were even terrified. They were awed, to say the least. And yet, at the same time, they must have felt alive, and alive in a way they haven't felt before. Because Peter almost immediately says, "This is good. This is good." He felt like he had arrived. He had reached his destination. Life couldn't be more whole than it was in that moment up on that lonely hilltop. We build huts. We settle where we feel like we have arrived, where we want to stay. We don't have the desire to move away from that spot. I think we all have had moments in our lives where we felt that we had arrived and that we felt we could stay. Maybe it's that moment when falling in love turns into a lifelong commitment, and you and your partner, your spouse, put a ring on each other's finger. Maybe your work is very meaningful to you, and it gives you a deep purpose in the society and in your life as well. And you are all in with your time, with your energy, with your creativity, with your passion. Maybe you would not want to miss the relationships you enjoy so much one day at a time. Your family, your friends, your neighbors, members of this church. It was one of the reasons why you come to church on Sunday morning so often, because you enjoy the people that you meet here, who have become your friends and maybe even more over the years. Elisha, the prophet, who we've heard about in our first reading today, he did not want to miss his teacher, Elijah. He did not want to live without that relationship, without being able to communicate with Elijah, to ask for advice, to get some of his spirit. The idea of losing him, the idea of God taking him away from him was just simply too scary. It was so scary that when he finally couldn't ignore it any longer, he still didn't want to talk about it. And when he finally faced up to it, he didn't want to let go without not just one portion, but a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Without a double dose of courage, faith, wisdom that would fill him and that would sustain him, Elisha did not want to let go of Elijah. And I totally get him. We always wish for the things that we need the most or lack the most. A double dose of wisdom or faith or hope, I could use that sometimes, and maybe you too. It's so much easier to come together on a Sunday morning in a beautiful and safe space like this one here, then live the gospel where we might face the loss of a loved one, where we live with our own limitations, with our fears, and all the things that maybe we don't like to think about and talk about because they would be too painful for us. And it doesn't matter whether you're 15 or 50 or 85. We too might ask and hope for that double dose of wisdom and strength and whatever it takes Elijah or us to face and tackle this life. Because sometimes, just sometimes, you just want to leave all that behind, all that makes this beautiful life, this beautiful world, into very often a messy and convoluted place. Even prophets, even disciples would love to leave that never-ending shade of the world behind them if God only let them, right? Like any of us would love to avoid personal suffering or the suffering of a loved one and friends and all that we struggle with from day to day, maybe including our own frailty, our own fears of letting go, having to face our own mortality, having to say goodbye more often in life than we wished for. And the fact that we often don't have an answer to that, but that we struggle and that we are on a journey to finding wisdom and strength and faith with God, not in this one moment of glory, but in a long, long journey. So I don't blame Elisha, the prophet, or Peter, the disciple in today's gospel, for trying to skip that whole part and instead saying, hey, let's build 3 dwellings and live life like an eternal Sunday morning. That's great, Peter. I'm with you. I've been there. I guess even as people of God who already know the end of the story, we know more than Peter knew at that time. We know that after Good Friday there's going to be Easter morning. Peter didn't. But even though we often need to be reminded that God's stories, that God's journey with us may lead through bright fields and plains, but also dark and painful valleys, but they end in resurrection. It's how today's gospel ends. The Son of Man risen from the dead. We may not always see that, but while we face tears and while we may face illness and death, we live and we walk in the presence of the risen one who walks with us. And it's in those so unlikely moments that don't feel glorious at all that, like Elisha, we will find God and God's healing and God's love and God's glory, which is so different from our idea of glory. I was reminded of a poem that you may have heard, Climb Up the Hill. It's from American poet Amanda Gorman. And this poem made me think that maybe that's how transfiguration looks for us in our lives. That even as we grieved, we grew. That even as we heard, we hoped. That even as we tired, we tried. For there's always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. And though none of us ever got, and none of us ever will see the whole glory of God, at least not in this place, in this earth, in this life, whatever we see now already, whatever we can taste now already, whatever we experience with God now already in this world, it's enough to trust and walk with him and be set free. I want to share a personal anecdote with you. I remember a call that Danny had with her uncle a few years ago. And it had been his wife's birthday. And so Danny called to congratulate her, except she couldn't talk to her. She had to talk to him because her aunt actually was suffering from dementia. And she didn't even know who was calling. So she asked her uncle, said, how is it today? How are you celebrating this day? And he said, we're celebrating it hand in hand. And that's how we live our lives right now, hand in hand. And I've always been grateful for that image. And it stayed with me. The two of them, this old couple, walking hand in hand from one moment to the next, one day at a time. And in my mind, I see God, like this welcoming Christ, taking us by our hand and walking with us from one moment to the next, one day at a time, and letting us see his glory in ways we can't